Hello, my name is Frank Waugh.
And my name is George Gilbert.
We are speaking to you from the grounds of the Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary in Columbia, South Carolina.
We would like for you to come with us now as we take you on a tour of three of the oldest known Lutheran congregations in North Carolina of what is presently the Lutheran Church in America.
Many people may not realize that the earliest Lutherans to settle in North Carolina were German.
Most of the early Lutherans that settled in North Carolina were from an area known as the Palatine region of Germany. They had migrated to America to flee the devastation and suffering that resulted from a century of recurring wars and the harsh winters of 1708 and 1709, and the coming into power of a Roman Catholic prince in that same region who forced all of those in that region to become Catholic.
It took them a few years to get to North Carolina, but some of them made it into the region as early as 1710. It was not until 1740 that any Lutheran settlements were made in North Carolina that we have any records of. A small bands of Lutherans made it over the roads that led across the Blue Ridge Mountains into the Piedmont region of North Carolina sometime around 1740. One group located along the Haw River in the part of Orange County, which later divided to also form Alamance and Guilford counties. Others found homes in what are now Davidson, Davie, Rowan, and Cabarrus counties. And within 25 years, there were German settlements all along the Catawba River and its tributaries.
The factual evidence indicates that three churches were built before 1750. St. John's in Salisbury, Morgan Church in Rowan County, and St. John's Lutheran Church in Cabarrus County. Come with us now as we explore these historic congregations and their histories as, in the beginning, there were three. St. John's Lutheran Church is located on a large tract of land in Cabarrus County, 6 miles east of Concord, North Carolina. A monument commemorating the work of Adolf Nussmann, who was the founding pastor of St. John's, as well as the first Lutheran pastor in North Carolina, was erected on the church lawn and dedicated by the Congregation of St. John's on November 10, 1935. In the archives of the church, a microfilm projector can be found which was purchased by the congregation in order that they might preserve precious historical documents, one being their first constitution in German bearing the signature of the Reverend Adolf Nussmann. Pastor Ted Goins opens the original shutters on the church, which is the fifth structure to be built on this site. Erected in 1845 and remodeled in 1888, one can see the visible difference in the bricks used to build the narthex and entrance, which was a later addition. The original foundation stones measured 4 to 5 feet long and 2 foot square, and were brought by horse and wagon from a quarry some 20 miles away in Salisbury. Let us go with Pastor Goins now into the sanctuary and hear some of the history of St. John's Lutheran Church, Cabarrus County.
I'm sitting here with Pastor Ted Goins, the present pastor of St. John's Church. Pastor Goins, I would like to ask you to tell the story of this congregation as you know it, starting with the early settlement of the Dutch Buffalo Creek Church.
Okay, I think we need to go back a little bit beyond that, because most of the people who came to this section came as a result of the political and religious upheaval in Germany along the Rhine Valley in the early 1700s. They came to Pennsylvania. Most landed at the port of Philadelphia. They came to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. They had relatives and they kept coming. And so there was no place for them to settle in Pennsylvania, so they had to seek out other places. And so the land was open in the Carolinas, and so to this day, if you follow from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, down the Shenandoah Valley to the Piedmont section of North Carolina, the Piedmont section of even of South Carolina, the Fork section, which you're familiar, even down into sections of Georgia, you find a string of Lutheran churches because of the Lutheran immigrants who came to find land. The Germans, being farmers, settled primarily in the Catawba and the Yadkin River valleys, where the farmland was fertile, where they could clear the land. And this is exactly why we have this church here, because of the early German settlers who came here. First off, they settled over on what's known as Dutch Buffalo Creek, and they call their meeting house church the Dutch Buffalo Meeting House, where they had their religious services, where they had their schools. The first church is supposed to have been of simple pine logs, nothing more, with no windows, with a dirt floor, where they met for religious and educational purposes. They struggled. They had no minister. And so finally they decided that they would move sometime about the 1760s to land just a half a mile east of here. It was still a joint church between the German Lutherans and the German Reform. Then sometime in the late 60s, or maybe early 70s, they moved to this spot and built their church, this being totally evangelical or totally Lutheran in background. They had no land. They settled on this land. In fact, they had no land until they had three buildings. They had had 3 buildings before they ever had a pastor. So the writings in the history said that they could not exist in this wilderness of heathens without religion and without education. And so they tried desperately to go back to Pennsylvania for spiritual guidance or ministers. There were none available. And so what they did was said that we must have, if our children are going to grow up in anything other than heathens. So they sent a man from this community and a man from a strong German community next door, Oregon Church, or the Old Zion Church section, sent to Charleston went to Charleston by horseback, went to Germany, solicited for a pastor and for a school master or school teacher. Adolf Nussmann decided that he would come with these folks back here to serve in this wild and woolly country, this wilderness, where later pastors wrote back and told the ministers or pleaded for young ministers to come. Said, don't you dare marry and come over here. Said, you better wait till you get here and marry a girl that's toughened and hardened to this. Literally, they said, don't come with your silk underwear, come with sturdy clothes and so forth. That's what they said, because it was a land that was wild and woolly, infested with wild animals and with ticks and all kinds of diseases and all kinds of robbers and all kinds of wilderness conditions. So they came here and started with Newsman and Arndt. They had to come, though, however, through London for the simple reason that this was a crown colony of England to get permission to come. So they got permission, came back here in 1774. Both men went to Oregon to live. A year later, Godfrey Arndt, who came as the school teacher, was ordained and became the pastor of Oregon. And Adolph Newsman came here to live and to serve the rest of his days from 1774 until 1794, at which time he died as a young man of 55. Tradition says there's no proof that he was branded on the neck by the people who were loyal because he was a colonist and supported the colonial cause. He's supposed to have been branded on the neck with a hot iron. It's said that his death was caused by that turning to cancer, and he died at the age of 55. So he came here and served this area and was the circuit rider, if you want to use that word, of all of the churches in this area, whereas Arndt served the area there and west toward Lincoln County and Catawba County. But Newsman remained here and was the pastor here, and of course went to all of the others. And we have records of baptisms, not his, but others later on, as far as over at Morning Star in Charlotte, Albert Matthews. And so the church existed and was strong here, and evidently grew from the German settlement here. This church that we're in now is the fifth building, being built itself, finished in 1846. It's said in the records that when it was finished, the words of the record says it was the most commodious, and I suppose that means most spacious church in western North Carolina when it was built, finished in 1846. This being the fifth building, we have the Red Meeting House, which was the fourth building, which we have what we call a modified replica, which you will see later in the cemetery. The Germans have been frugal, dedicated Lutherans, and have been here for now, this is the 241st year. And so this is a brief background. Maybe you have questions or comments to make in connection, and I'll be happy to.
Pastor Goin, St. John's Church has had a very rich history in terms of Lutheranism in North Carolina, and surely there have been quite a few famous or influential people that have had association with this church, other than just Adolph Newsman. Could you elaborate on some of those people, even up to
a number of outstanding people? And one that comes to mind to begin with is along the pastors. A Pastor Graber, I believe it was, who was pastor here in 1830, followed the migration of the Lutherans to Illinois, because they left here because of the lack of land, and he became the pastor of St. John's Lutheran Church near Hillsboro, Illinois, and is buried there in that church. Now the church is defunct, but he is buried there, and all of the ancestors were from here, the names and all are there. Several people in connection with the history of the North Carolina Synod. We had David Hinkle, who was pastor here at one time, and of course the Hinkleites or the Hinkles were at one time involved in the Hinkelite movement or the Tennessee Synod organization. However, St. John's was never a Hinkelite church or belonged to the Tennessee Synod to my knowledge, so he is one that was pastor here. We had a lot of the staunch German pastors who believed in the Lutheran way, even some of the Hempstead letters that we do not have here but were sent back to Germany as a result of the pastors reporting back home, as it were, back to their missionary society, because they did receive support and prayers and so forth, and books and so forth over there. One wrote back in connection with the Hempstead letters that he encouraged his people to marry Germans, not the English who lived in the eastern section of, or the western section of Cabarrus County. He said that they were raised their children as heathens, and their wives wouldn't listen, so as was accustomed to the old German custom. We have one of your leaders in South Carolina who was pastor of this church from 1945, I believe, to 1949, Dr. Herman Cauble, who is your bishop at the present time down in South Carolina. And of course, connected with the seminary also is Dr. L. David Miller. Believe it or not, he grew up in this congregation. His father served here, and this was his home church, and I think to this day considers this his home church. In fact, 2 weeks ago, 2 Sundays ago, he was here for homecoming. And we were happy to have him, and also happy to have him as a son of our congregation. We're noted for the historical background here at St. John's. We have, I don't know whether it's a distinction or not, but we have a lot of famous ministers who are buried here. Dr. Moose, who was the president, but a professor at the seminary for a long time. This is his home congregation. He's buried here. I guess the latest person of importance to our synod who is buried here, Dr. Whitaker, chose St. John's to be his final resting place, and is buried here in our cemetery. And so through the ages, down through the ages, St. John's has contributed a great deal to the synod. A lot of people who've come from this congregation to serve in the church. We also consider the bishop, Bishop McDaniel, because he was born and reared here in Mount Pleasant. Also the editor of the Lutheran, the same, Mount Pleasant. So we kindly adopt them. They're really from Holy Trinity, Mount Pleasant, but from this community. So we have had a number of influential people to come from this area and from this congregation.
We now take you to the modified replica of the Red Meeting House, which was dedicated in 1785.
In the midst of the graves of those faithful who served in the little old Red Meeting House, a smaller replica of the meeting house is found. It was the 4th structure built by the congregation of St. John's. Being painted red, it came to be called and was known, as long as it stood, as the old Red Meeting House. Here we find a framed confirmation certificate dated the same day the building was dedicated, July 4th, 1785.
Rock that's found inside of the little Red Meeting House, which is here for preservation, and I'll read the inscription that we have here. This tombstone, being in German and broken, was found on the ground with no visible evidence of where it belonged. For its preservation, it was placed here as a memorial to all those buried in these sacred grounds in graves which are not marked. The English translation, Scripture, Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth. Yea, saith the Spirit, they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them. And the inscription, Michael Vesperman, he was, and the rest is broken.
Prior to the building of the old Red Meeting House, a 3rd house of worship was located in the midst of what is now the St. John's Graveyard. The house was built chiefly at the expense of one member, Captain John Paul Behringer, and as a mark of appreciation, the congregation had a large, elevated, and enclosed pew constructed for the exclusive use of he and his family. Also in the graveyard is the church's founding pastor's grave, the Reverend Adolph Nussman, as Pastor Goins points out, which is a newer stone, the original located in the church's archives. Also on the tract of land owned by St. John's is the new Fellowship Hall and a new softball and baseball complex. In the church's archives is the original gravestone for Adolf Nussmann, which is engraved in the original German. St. John's Lutheran Church of Cabarrus County. Another of the earliest congregations in North Carolina is St. John's Lutheran Church in Salisbury, North Carolina. Like St. John's Cabarrus County, St. John Salisbury was also developed through the able endeavors of Reverend Adolf Nussmann. Located in the heart of downtown Salisbury, only 1 block from the square, it is one of the largest churches in the North Carolina Synod. We were fortunate to speak with the associate pastor, the Reverend Fred Gottwald, about the history of St. John's.
Been only here for 3 years, but doing the research on it with the historian Martha Agner, we're in the process of writing a book on the congregation's history. She tells me that there were 5 buildings, that the earliest building that they can identify is in the cemetery, which places the history of the congregation, the beginning of it, at least to 1768. The deed of the cemetery by Beard to the congregation, and the trustees of the congregation are mentioned in that deed. So that's a firm date at the beginning. The congregation has used other dates. One of them is 1747, which is the first one. That date probably represents the earliest immigrants into the Salisbury area, and they conjecture that these immigrants brought their house chapels with them, their sermon books and the hymn books, and we must remember that they were an ethnic group, a German-speaking group in the midst of a sea of English-speaking people. And so they were very self-conscious of their culture and of their faith. The second building was a wooden structure outside of the cemetery. And then the major move up onto Main Street. And they built on the corner of Liberty and Main 2 structures. The first one was threatening to fall down, and they had to build it. The original structure was built in 1849, of that 3rd building. And by 83, it had to be torn down, and they replaced it with a much larger brick building. And then in 1926, they moved from there to the present location here at Inna Street, 1926. The interesting thing about these buildings are that within them they did major renovations. Every building had at least 2, and the structure we're in now had 3 interiors, so to speak, in the process. Historic events of some significance have happened because this was a large congregation in a very central community in the state, in the Piedmont area. synod meeting was held at St. John's. That must have been in that clapboard or wooden structure. Let's see. We don't know. We know approximately where it is, but of course it hasn't survived. The earliest pastors in this area were, and their names you reminded me of, are Nussbaum and Arenz, were involved in this congregation. The interesting thing is it was just called the Lutheran Church in Salisbury for a long time, until they had a pastor whose name was John, and then they began to call it John's Church, John's Lutheran Church. Okay? And there eventually became St. John's, which is an interesting background. The pastors who made these steps in terms of movement of these buildings, there's an interesting, in the second brick church on Main Street, North Main Street, there was a major renovation in 1896, and they moved from a Lutheran pattern which looks somewhat like the Swedish churches with an enclosed altar rail, and in fact they had a pulpit on a pedestal, crude looking, but there, to a table, but they kept the altar rail. And they had a walnut table built, do this in remembrance of me, okay? And it had a Methodist influence. I think the pastor's wife was Methodist. Whether this is that's truth in that, I don't know. But the interesting thing is that each time they had moved or made a major renovation, they kept something of the past, and this was that altar rail. But then in 1916, they had another major renovation of that interior of the second brick church on Main Street. The interior of that, of course, then was sold in 26 when they came here to the St. Luke's Church in Tyro. And if you want to see what it looked like in 1916, you could just go up there and take a look. The whole interior, pews, pulpit, lectern, altar, baptismal font, were all sold to them for $2,000. So they got the interior of their church for that much.
There are good reasons for believing that this congregation, united with Oregon Church and St. John's Lutheran Church of Cabarrus County, in sending commissioners to Germany in the search of a preacher and schoolteacher in 1772. For immediately upon their return in 1773, preacher Adolf Nussmann became the pastor of all three churches and settled in Salisbury.